Hello. In this presentation, I will be discussing the role of cocaine in violent deaths from the view of the forensic toxicologist. In order to understand the relationship of cocaine and violence, it is important to briefly review the pharmacology of cocaine. Cocaine inhibits the reuptake of catecholamine neurotransmitters, norepinephrine, dopamine, and serotonin. Specifically for dopamine, cocaine blocks the dopamine transporter, increasing levels of dopamine in the reward centers of the brain. Looking at the picture, on the left, we see the normal process of the synthesis and release of dopamine from the presynaptic neuron into the synaptic cleft, and its binding to the postsynaptic dopamine receptor, along with the reuptake of dopamine back into the presynaptic neuron by the dopamine transporter. In the picture to the right, cocaine prevents the reuptake of dopamine into the presynaptic dopaminergic neuron by binding to receptors on the dopamine transporter located on the dopaminergic nerve terminal. This dopamine reuptake, which is mediated by sodium chloride and energy-dependent active transport, is inhibited when cocaine binds to the sodium binding site on the transporter and alters the chloride binding site, thus preventing the binding of both ions. Because translocation of dopamine across the membrane of the presynaptic neuron is inhibited, increased extracellular dopamine concentrations chronically stimulate the dopamine receptor in the postsynaptic neuron. The physiological effects of stimulant drugs are primarily mediated by norepinephrine. Norepinephrine is responsible for what is frequently termed the fight or flight response. So what would we expect the effects to be? We would expect increased blood pressure and heart rate, increased pupil size or mydriasis, and increased body temperature. The desirable effects, or the effect of reward, are primarily mediated by dopamine. These include locomotor stimulation, euphoria or rush, elevation of mood, increased energy, alertness, sociability, confidence, although that may be unwarranted, sexual arousal, and decreased need for food and sleep, all which can be summed up as fun. As concentrations of neurotransmitters increase in the receptors, depending on the dose of cocaine and patterns of use, some of the undesirable behavioral effects of cocaine may be observed. These include paranoia, possible assaultive behavior, as well as serotonin-mediated hallucinations, hyperthermia, psychosis, and a possible excited delirium and death. Normally, after the stores of catecholamines have been used up and/or drug use ends, we observe that what goes up must come down. This results in dysphoria or a crash, irritability, drug craving, depression, and extreme fatigue. A better way of looking at these effects is looking at the hysteresis of stimulant drug effects. These effects are based on either the upside or downside after drug use. On the upside, at low doses, with peak cocaine concentrations of up to about 200 nanograms per milliliter, there is some euphoria, relief from fatigue, and even improved reaction time. Negative psychomotor effects at these concentrations can occur, but are uncommon. Note, however, that the concentration alone does not predict if a person is on the upside or downside. With higher doses of cocaine or repeated binge use, there are increasing deleterious effects, ranging from nervousness to agitation, delusions, hallucinations, irrational behavior, violence, severe hypertension, seizures, coma, and possibly death. Cocaine has a short half-life of about 1 hour. It has two ester moieties, rendering it susceptible to hydrolysis in vitro and in vivo. The alkyl ester of cocaine is hydrolyzed to benzoylecgonine via spontaneous pH-dependent hydrolysis, as well as liver methylesterases. The phenyl ester is hydrolyzed to ecgonine methyl ester by plasma cholinesterase and liver benzolesterases. Both of these metabolites are inactive. The major metabolite, benzoylecgonine, has a half-life of about 4 to 6 hours, so benzoylecgonine will accumulate as cocaine concentrations fall. If cocaine is used with ethanol, cocaethylene is produced through transesterification. Unlike benzoylecgonine and ecgonine methyl ester, cocaethylene is an active compound that has been shown to produce even greater euphoria than cocaine itself. The conversion of cocaine to cocaethylene occurs about 3.5 times faster than the conversion of cocaine to benzoylecgonine, thereby potentially increasing toxicity. In vitro hydrolysis of cocaine can occur if blood samples are not preserved with a pseudocholinease inhibitor, such as sodium fluoride, and if not refrigerated or frozen for longer-term storage. This can have a significant effect when it comes to interpreting cocaine cases. With that as background, let's look at cases positive for cocaine and/or benzoylecgonine at the Wayne County Medical Examiner's Office in Detroit from 1992 to 2009. As you can see, the incidence of benzoylecgonine in natural cases is generally less than 10%. The highest incidence is in cases that are initially pending toxicology, which makes sense. However, note that the incidence of cocaine-related homicides is also very high, reaching a maximum of 25% in 1995. In the early 1990s, the incidence of homicides was even greater than in pending toxicology cases. Later, the incidence fell somewhat, consistent with more recent data that we will look at later. So why is there such a high percentage of cocaine-related homicides? At the 1993 Society of Forensic Toxicologists meeting, Dr. Stephen Higgins, a behavioral pharmacologist from the University of Vermont, presented some of the models in which cocaine can be associated with violence. The first of these, the economic compulsive model, describes the violence that occurs to others in order to obtain money to buy cocaine. The psychopharmacological model is just what it sounds like, whereby the pharmacology of cocaine itself can be the direct causal agent, as it may precipitate violent behavior through the mechanisms we discussed earlier. This violent behavior may lead up to a so-called cocaine-excited delirium, which includes bizarre behavior, extreme strength, hyperthermia, and sudden death. The third model is the systemic model. Here, violent interactions may result from a person's involvement with an expensive but illicit commodity. An example here would be the drug deal that goes bad. By its very nature, dealing in illicit drugs tends to recruit violent people. The self-administration of cocaine may compound these situations as described by a psychopharmacological model. Cocaine and ethanol can also cause increased risk-taking that can turn violent due to the effects of a stimulant drug with one that causes disinhibition. Additionally, the societal environment cocaine abusers are in render them to an increased risk for homicide. Here is some data on the incidence of cocaine and homicides in the city of New York between 1990 and 1991. In 2,824 homicides during this period, cocaine and/or benzoylecgonine were present in 884, or 31% of cases. When alcohol was present with cocaine, it was more than twice as likely that the parent drug would be detected than only benzoylecgonine, emphasizing the association of combined acute cocaine and ethanol use in violence-related deaths. Other authors have reported similar increases of cocaine and benzoylecgonine in homicide cases from the 1980s to 2000, ranging from 28% to 33%. More recent data suggests a shift away from cocaine-related homicides, but not necessarily from stimulant drug use overall in homicides. For example, in 2020 in Cook County, Illinois, city of Chicago, there were 986 homicides. The most frequently detected stimulant drug was MDMA, or ecstasy, at 12.3%, followed by cocaine and/or benzoylecgonine at 7.7% and methamphetamine at 5.1%. All of these drugs have similar pharmacology, putting users at similar risks. Of note, with the ubiquitous nature of fentanyl as an abused drug today, it is not surprising to see some fentanyl-positive homicides, even though opioid use does not result in the same types of behavior as would be seen with cocaine. However, it should be noted that while fentanyl was detected in 6.8% of homicides in Chicago in 2020, the percent of all tested cases positive for fentanyl that year was an astounding 40.8%. Let's look at some concentrations of cocaine and metabolites detected in homicides in 2020 in Chicago. While there were some exceptions, Most cocaine and benzoylecgonine concentrations were not that high, as reflected by median concentrations of 540 nanograms per milliliter for benzoylecgonine and 100 nanograms per milliliter for cocaine. This may account for the lower incidence of cocaine and homicides in recent years, as the cocaine and benzoylecgonine concentrations measured in the 1990s were considerably higher than currently, potentially increasing the likelihood of violent behavior resulting in death. To make a direct comparison from 2000 and 2020, we took another look at drugs detected in homicides in Wayne County, Michigan. While the incidence of cocaine and/or benzoylecgonine in homicides in 2000 was 28%, it had fallen to 9.1% in 2020. There were almost no methamphetamine cases in 2000, and this now accounted for a 5% increase in homicide cases, which is a significant change. Similar to Cook County, there was an 8.9% incidence of fentanyl in homicides, with an overall incidence of fentanyl in 32.1% of cases tested. Looking at the concentrations of cocaine and benzoylecgonine in the Detroit data set, we see similar data as with Cook County, with median concentrations of 560 nanograms per milliliter for benzoylecgonine and 88 nanograms per milliliter for cocaine. This again reflects the lower cocaine concentrations observed today than 20 years ago. Up to now, we have considered violent cocaine-related deaths that were determined to be homicides. However, accidental cocaine-related deaths may also be associated with violence. The behavior of cocaine in an intoxicated person can result in traumatic injuries. This includes head injuries, fatal cuts while smashing mirrors or glass, or injuries sustained in a motor vehicle crash related to cocaine use, both as a driver or as a pedestrian. One particular issue with cocaine use in a violent situation is the potential or perceived need for restraints due to a subject's behavior or actions. This can lead to a potentially fatal outcome. For example, cardiac toxicity can occur due to an excess of neurotransmitters caused by the hyperactivity while struggling against restraints and the drug itself. There may also be alterations in the brain affecting release and transport of neurotransmitters. Finally, the restraints themselves may contribute due to potential positional or compression asphyxia. This can lead to allegations of misconduct. During a violent confrontation, chemical sprays or tasers may be deployed and or various types of potential asphyxia. These may include mechanical, such as a neck hold, positional with physical restraints, or restraint asphyxia, such as chest compression. If a death occurs, whether from cocaine and or the violent interaction, cocaine concentrations may not be elevated due to the delay in death. Delayed deaths may also occur later in a squad car, ambulance, at a correctional facility, or emergency department. Above all, if an individual appears intoxicated, it is important to get EMS as soon as possible and end the confrontation. Even if the victim appears to have calmed down, drug effects may not be over, and it would still be advisable to have a period of medical observation rather than transporting the individual directly to a correctional facility. One issue that frequently requires addressing is whether the use of tasers may contribute to a fatal outcome. Naturally, the opinion on this varies between manufacturers and other parties. Strout et al. Looked at taser-related deaths and found that over half had previous cardiovascular disease. But of the nearly 80% that were positive for illegal drugs, 86% were on stimulant drugs, and 75% were said to have been in a state of excited delirium. Ultimately, in 27% of cases studied, deployment of a taser was thought to be a potential or contributory cause of death. Finally, I would like to briefly discuss the role of cocaine fatal crashes, which are also deaths of violence, whether to the driver or to the pedestrian that the driver may have hit. Between 1996 and 1998, I studied the role of cocaine in fatal motor vehicle crashes in Wayne County, Michigan, and Greater Detroit. During that period, there were 253 motor vehicle fatalities. 25, or 10%, were positive for cocaine and or benzoylecgonine, which is similar to other published studies in regions where cocaine use is prevalent. Driving behavior in many of these cases was typical of what might be associated with use of a stimulant drug, in this case, cocaine. These included police chases, possibly related to paranoia, driving at a high rate of speed, related to increased risk-taking with cocaine and or combined cocaine and alcohol use, loss of vehicle control, secondary to high-risk driving with the possibility of this leading to a vehicular homicide, ignoring traffic lights, and out-of-lane travel, possibly due to visual disturbances and also during the downside of cocaine use due to fatigue. This is just a sample of articles describing cocaine-related behaviors which may affect driving, including self-reports of suspiciousness, distrust, or paranoia, road rage, and use of cocaine associated with police chases. Looking at the concentration of cocaine and benzoylecgonine in motor vehicle-related fatalities, we see once again that the median concentrations were very similar in what we saw in recent cocaine-related homicides, and that cocaine concentrations did not need to be particularly high to have contributed to a violent outcome. It should be noted that 14 out of 25 cocaine-related fatal crashes were also positive for ethanol. Again, the use of a stimulant drug with one that causes disinhibition can result in greater risk-taking. To summarize, here are some interpretation takeaways. In most homicides, the drug concentration may not be a factor in case interpretation, and certainly not the cause and manner of death. However, there may be later civil challenges, especially in cases of deaths in custody, deaths secondary to a violent confrontation, and claims of self-defense. Remember, cocaine has a short half-life, about an hour, and may no longer be present if death is delayed. Also, if samples were collected in hospital, these samples may not have been preserved with sodium fluoride or refrigerated, resulting in cocaine hydrolysis. Most importantly, we know that therapeutic and toxic concentrations of cocaine overlap, making interpretation extremely difficult. And by therapeutic, I am referring to concentrations where cocaine was used in ear, nose, and throat procedures, ocular procedures, and wound dressing, but also occasional recreational use. So some conclusions to consider. Stimulant drugs are frequently detected in violent deaths. The incidence of cocaine in homicides has decreased over the last 20 years in some jurisdictions, despite overall increases in medical examiner coroner cases involving cocaine use. This is possibly related to lower concentrations resulting in fewer violent confrontations. Other stimulant drugs are frequently observed, such as methamphetamine or MDMA, subject to regional differences. The ubiquitous nature of fentanyl makes this opioid a commonly detected drug involving violence. This is a shift from the past and may represent powerful tolerance to this drug. As always, assess each case considering the triad of scene investigation, pathology, always perform an autopsy, and appropriate toxicological studies. With that, I will conclude, and here is my email, and please feel free to email any questions that you may have. Thank you very much for your attention.